Thank you, Akshit. Thank you, everyone. It's been really great hearing about all the talks last week. I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I tried to get a quick idea of what all has been covered in the last week's lectures. And thanks to Jacopo, who has given a wonderful introduction to basics of stochastic processes today. So today, the way I have planned my lecture is such that I will not be using too much of mathematical uh, tools and jargons. We'll try to work with what you have learned last week in the context of nonlinear dynamics, and we will introduce some elements of stochasticity. Okay, and we have a tutorial later this evening, which will be covered by Arshad, and where I encourage you all to come with your laptops if you have one, and some familiarity with Python will be helpful, but not really essential. Okay, and then on Thursday, I will probably do slightly more mathematical stuff, derive using the ideas of master equations. Okay, and then on Friday, it depends on how you react on Thursday. Okay, so we'll see. So we'll keep it flexible, and again, as Jacopo mentioned, keep it as I would like to keep it as discussion friendly as possible, as informal as possible, which also means I haven't prepared very concrete things to say. So we will keep it, depending on how you find interesting, how much of the stuff you find interesting. Okay, so let me start with this slide. So if I showed you this slide, which actually is a real data. Okay, there is some thing plotted on the y-axis, which is a measure of some proxy of vegetation in a landscape. Okay, and what you see here is that this proxy remains around some mean value for some time, and you see that it suddenly has now gone to some other mean value and is fluctuating around those mean values, that mean value. So if you look at this, can you make some connection to what you have learned over the last 1 week? Sorry?
Stable fixed point has shifted.
The stable fixed point has shifted. Okay, that's one possibility. Anything else?
We can say there is a large perturbation which changed from one stable fixed point to another stable fixed point.
Okay, there is a large perturbation that's changed from one fixed point to another fixed point, which implicitly assumes there were multiple fixed points. Yes. Right? Okay, excellent. Anything else? If I plot a histogram, there would be two modes in the histogram. Excellent, very good. Okay, that's actually great. So you have learned really well, and so we can actually try to understand this real data using some of the ideas of nonlinear dynamics. We can think of this part of the data as some fluctuations around a stable equilibrium, right? A fixed point. And this is another stable equilibrium, some fluctuations around it. Now, but I want to emphasize one thing here. One of you pointed out that the fixed point shifted. The other said there were already two fixed points, but some kind of stochasticity pushed it from one to the other. Now, how do I know which of them is correct? Are both of them very reasonable, right? There was one fixed point that suddenly got switched to some other fixed point. Maybe, for example, the rainfall was very heavy, okay, and the rainfall suddenly switched off, and therefore extremely vegetated landscape of the Northern Sahara became a desert. Okay, so the rainfall changed dramatically, therefore the fixed point changed, so therefore the system responded, the vegetation responded by being from a high vegetation to a low vegetation state. Another scenario that somebody else implied was that, there were two fixed points, so it was a massive stochastic fluctuation that just kicked out from one to the other, right? So these two are really entirely plausible explanations if this is the only information that we currently have. Okay, so we'll get back to which of them is probably more correct in a bit of time, and I will not answer this question in the context of this very specific data set, but we will think about this broader question of how do we infer something about real data sets by our understanding of nonlinear dynamics and stochasticity. Okay, that's our goal. Now, this is another example. So what do you think is happening here? There are some hints that are given in the form of colors and dotted lines. So what do you think happened here? You can see real data gets noisier. You will not see these nice lines that you would draw in a deterministic model, right? So which is why we have to really understand stochasticity. So what do you think is happening here?
Some intervention that happens after
Okay. Has recovered. Okay, that's a very interesting interpretation. The grass cover is very low here. There is some intervention that happens around this here, therefore the grass cover recovers. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, excellent. So we have to go and ask the people who work in this area, did you do any interventions? That's a very likely hypothesis. Anything else? Yeah.
It seems like the grass cover is fluctuating around two different means. And so there's always like some variation around the mean, but the means have changed.
Means have changed. Okay, so basically there was this fluctuation. In fact, you can see there's some sign of going to a very different mean value, very high grass cover value, but it sort of came back, but now it shifts at some point. So there were two means, which is sort of similar to the idea that there were two stable equilibrium and there was a switch. Okay, what else? Yeah.
But actually, if you just remove the colors and the dotted line,
Okay.
I would just say that it's increasing and fluctuating.
It's okay. It's a very another possible interpretation. Okay. Okay. So now, of course, how do you distinguish those two? Is it sort of linearly or increasing with time, or was there some sort of a non-linear change, right? So if you read the paper, you will sort of realize that we rule out that linear change hypothesis, and in fact there was a non-linear change which justifies the color coding we have done. Okay, so those are all possibilities. That's we should when we as theorists, when we look at data, we are often tempted to always think of the data nicely fitting to my theory. Okay, well, of course my theory has to be right. Okay, but we must be extremely open to the possibility that it's something very mundane and boring that's happening in data. Okay. Any other comments before I move forward? By the way, I will not answer any of these specific questions. I'm going to use these to motivate some techniques we learn, some broad principles we learn today, and I will return to this graph though. Okay. So let me show you one more, maybe. This is another example. So now, back in the days, we didn't always have amazing long time series. This was actually, but given that, despite that, this shows something very interesting. Again, the colors and dotted lines are giving you lots of hints. Okay, what does this suggest? Okay, some sort of memory in the system, right? Okay, it suggests something interesting, that there are some, you can see some arrows here, right? Some arrows there. Okay, those indicate the fact that when things were changing over time, they didn't sort of follow a same path. There was a different path that the system followed in the forward direction of the x-axis, which is the total phosphorus concentration in the lake, and they followed a different path when you're inverted back. Of course, one can say, hey, you know what, this is just the data is too noisy and you're sort of overfitting your your theory. Possible, we cannot rule that out, but it presents some things that you may have seen in the last week. Did you learn about bifurcations and hysteresis? Okay, so this is potentially a real data example of having a hysteresis. Okay, and this is another example. Okay, people often use to indicate that. So by now, I think you're all getting the point that I'm trying to make. Okay, there are often nonlinear changes in many real data sets. And these nonlinear changes are, of course, happen in a stochastic world. So the nonlinearity and stochasticity is intertwined, and we need to make sense of the underlying dynamics given a stochastic data. And if you're extremely lucky in these kind of cases, you actually have a very high resolution data over time. And that is when you can often make best inferences, but you're all not always that lucky, and you have to do with much simpler, maybe a single snapshot of various things that may be happening. Okay, so so even a lot of people argue that something like financial meltdowns are like these bifurcations that you have studied in nonlinear dynamics. Okay, so there have been many historically important financial market crashes, and this is one of them that I'm showing in this graph. Okay, so now sort of what is the take-home message from all these? What you see is that there was an abrupt change in one of the state variables of a complex system that we are studying, right? And the second point, okay, is something I actually did not say, sort of demonstrate anywhere in the graphs, that but sort of, typically these may happen even when the drivers themselves does not seem to have changed a whole lot. Okay, and that is really what makes them interesting. If there was a drastic change in a driver, you do expect a drastic response, and that is not really surprising, right? If there was a massive rainfall, you do expect sudden rejuvenation of forests. Not surprising. If there was a drought over a large consecutive droughts over a period of time, you do expect the forests to decline. Those are not surprising, right? However, even for small changes in the driver, sometimes you can actually have a very nonlinear abrupt response of systems. And these sort of abrupt responses and the change in the stable state could even be irreversible in a real ecological context. For example, for many lake ecosystems, once a lake has switched from a clear water state, which is often called an oligotrophic state, which has a type of macrophyte vegetation community and fish community and so on, if that switches to an eutrophic state, which is high in nutrients, a very different kind of vegetation, and a very different kind of the fish and other communities. Now, once it has switched, even if you sort of withdraw yourself from any sort of disturbances, it's going to get stuck there. It's not going to revert back, probably on the lifetimes of us. Okay, so it would require some dramatic intervention to revert it back. Okay, in some cases it may, for really large scale ecosystems, those time scales are so large that you can effectively call them irreversible. Okay, so so in this context, people have been using these terms. So these abrupt changes are often called regime shifts, abrupt transitions, and also called tipping points. Okay, and there are more terms which I will sort of define over the course of this lecture. These are also called critical transitions. I'm going to define something called stochastic transitions in addition, and you have heard about bifurcation points and hysteresis. So these are all the various terminologies that are associated with these nonlinear dynamical systems. Okay, so we learn over these some of these points. So there are two sort of broad questions that I would like to address in the first part of my talk today. One is that how can we mathematically model such systems? Now, the nice thing is, when I typically give this talk, the audience would not know anything about nonlinear dynamics, so I'll have to do it from scratch, but luckily you're all amazing. So the first part will be relatively easy for me. I will show you some models that can capture these ideas of abrupt transitions, multiple stable states, and then from a purely applied perspective, what would an ecosystem manager want? They would want to know, hey, look, I'm managing these lakes, I'm managing these forests. Can you tell me ahead of time before bad things happen, right? So there's been a lot of interest in sort of thinking of, or can we come up with some early warning signals of an impending transition? For example, of course, this is really, I don't think we are talking about early warning signals on this scale. Actually, to be very honest, even on this scale, these are really important for climatic events, because once the climate shifts to an entirely different state, you really can't get them back over hundreds of years of time scale. So probably more on these time scales, like, if you're looking at a grassland restoration or even a lake restoration, over a few decades, you may see some changes, but can I know a little ahead of time, a few years and a decade ahead of time, to take some preventive actions, right? So that's one of the questions that has really intrigued ecologists. And to address this, the mathematics of nonlinear dynamics and with some stochasticity is actually really, really helpful. So how do we do this? How do we go about understanding this? Okay, so now, before I go to the next slides, let us recap a few things that you probably already know, right? So let's say V is the sort of state variable I'm interested in. Right? So how do you usually write a generic? Oh, I shouldn't have chosen V, sorry. Actually, because my slides have V, I don't have a choice. Okay. So you can write a very general dynamical system equation of this type, right? Okay, so there is some function that determines the rate of change of, okay, the state variable over time. Okay, so now, now when you have a stable equilibrium, so let's say V star is a stable equilibrium. So what happens if I make a perturbation to the equilibrium? System comes back. Okay, so let us denote X as a deviation from the stable equilibrium. Okay, so what would be the dynamics of this X? What would be an equation that determines the dynamics of a deviation from a stable equilibrium? F of V? Do you remember? Somebody?
Minus kx.
Minus kx. How many of you agree with that? Okay. So do you all remember stability analysis? So what does stability analysis do? What's the basic idea of stability analysis? So you have an equilibrium and you make a small perturbation. And when you make a small perturbation, what you can do is you can do a Taylor series expansion around the equilibrium, right? And drop all the terms that are of the second order and higher. Okay. So I can only keep the linear term in the strength in the amount of perturbation, right? So basically, so this can be approximated as some minus alpha x or kx, whatever you choose, where alpha is given by. So derivative of the function f as a function of v computed at the equilibrium value. Okay, and since I told you it's a stable equilibrium, what's the value? Is it alpha positive or negative? Alpha has to be positive. Okay. Okay, is this much something that I can I assume everybody knows here, right? So you have done generalized load Coverterra models probably last week, right? So this is probably much simpler than all those. So what this tells you is that the perturbation from an equilibrium, follows this very simple equation. And if you were to look at the temporal evolution of the perturbation, it would basically decay exponentially. Okay, excellent. We are on the same page now. So now, of course, the real world is. I wish the real world was as simple, right? So what is key that is missing here? What's the key thing that's missing here? For example, if this was that stable state, what is the key thing that this fails to fully explain what's happening there? Stable point itself? Why is it not present? X measures the deviation from the stable state. Why should the absolute value not matter so much? Okay, so something we don't do here is the stochasticity is not present here at all. So one very simple way to start incorporating stochasticity is to write a differential equation directly for how the perturbations change. Remember, x is basically from equilibrium, and then I add a term which I denote by eta t that basically tells that there is some amount of stochasticity that is driving the x. X is the deviation from the equilibrium. Now the x can take positive or negative values, which is just telling you that it's going above the equilibrium and coming below the equilibrium. Okay, now what exactly is eta t? Okay, so now of course, for those who have been attentive in the last class, you know that if you don't know anything about stochastic process, stochasticity, you always start with what? A Gaussian distribution. So basically you make two assumptions: the mean of the stochastic process is 0. So it's fluctuating, you know, it's fluctuating in a way that it doesn't have any bias. So it is the rate of change of the perturbations are influenced by this time dependent kind of crazy thing, but this crazy thing doesn't have any bias. It's basically the average is 0. That's the first assumption we make. And the second assumption we make is not only that, we actually assume something that it's basically a Gaussian distribution. Now it turns out that, you know, so as I said, I'm going to be a bit sloppy from a purely mathematician's point of view. So more specifically, I'm going to assume that this is basically a normal distribution with mean 0 and a standard deviation sigma. Okay. Not only that, see, I'm drawing this crazy thing is driving these perturbations at every point in time, right? Is it sufficient to just say the mean is 0 and the distribution is Gaussian? Do I need to say anything more? By the way, this already has the mean, by the way. So this is I wanted to start off with a simpler thing, but so is it sufficient to just describe the distribution, or should I say something more about this eta t? What would that be? So eta depends on time. How does it change with time? So it's possible that there is a stochastic variable that is crazily changing over time, but even then it can have some relationship between 2 points in time. So what we assume here is that it has no correlations. So we sort of denote it in the following way. If I take this random variable at time t and another time t prime, this is basically this is a Dirac delta function, which basically means that for any time point which are different, when t is not equal to t prime, if I take two random numbers, it doesn't matter how close they are or how far they are, if they are not same, this term will always be 0. Only when they are same point, I'm basically measuring the variance. Okay. So when we write down an equation of this form, so these often go by the name Langevin equation in physics. So Langevin equation is basically a general term that people use to sort of say how a dynamical variable is influenced by stochasticity. Okay, and it's also specifically called Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, named basically on two sort of, I think applied mathematicians, if I'm right, who sort of derived various properties of this equation. Okay. Now there are many subtle aspects that are associated with this differential equation. This differential equation in quotes, because when you think of differential equations, one of the fundamental assumptions we make is that the right hand side must be a nicely differentiable function, right? So the moment you have something here eta t, which has no relationship to each other for any finitely different time. So this is not even a well-defined differential equation if you are a mathematician. Okay, so that's something I'm sort of keeping under the rug and will not really discuss a whole lot today. Yes, you have a question. Yes.
Yeah, so in the Langevin equation, if you put alpha is equal to 0, so would that
That's
mean
a great question. Yeah.
So the perturbation would be driven only by the stochasticity.
Absolutely brilliant question. Okay.
And so would that mean that there is no guarantee that it would return to the fixed point?
What do you think?
I mean, I think if it is driven only by stochasticity, it is random. So you don't know if the system would return to the fixed point.
Okay, this is a really good question. Can somebody else answer? Can somebody answer this question? Yes. Okay, I know I have, but he's pushing me to make it 0. I can. Because once I have written down the equation, I can sort of move away from where I came from, right? Okay, I can.
If alpha equals to 0, then the system only driven by the stochasticity. There is no attractant to understand.
That's great. So I want somebody to make a connection with what happened in the last class. It actually would then become a random walk. So if x is the position of some particle, individual, whoever it is, you can move away from the state variable. Okay, for the time being. Okay, so basically, a state variable driven entirely kicked by randomness at every point in time is nothing but Brownian motion.
In this case, would there not have second order Taylor series of fraction level neglecting the
So that's why I said, the point was I'm now not trying to make connection with this anymore. So the idea is, once I'm here, now if I forget all of this, if I now set alpha is equal to 0, but you're right, you're absolutely right. If I wanted to go back to, how does it relate to f of v when I set alpha is equal to 0, you're absolutely right. I should have had a higher order term. Brilliant, really good point. Okay. So basically we can think of, so the simplest way to define fluctuations around a stable equilibrium is via this equation called Ornstein-Wilhelmsberg process. Okay. So now I will not really do a much more. So it would take probably 1 or 2 classes to analyze this equation in various different ways. So I'm not going to do all of that today, but let me just say one small thing here. So mathematicians do not like to write it this way, for the reason that this right hand side is not a well-defined function, because eta t is a crazy thing. Sort of in every point of time it's changing in an arbitrary amount which none of us have a clue. Okay, we don't know how it is changing because it's independent, right? Okay, so what mathematicians prefer to do is to write it this way. Okay, plus where what they have basically done is they do not write anymore in the form of a differential equation. These are called, by the way, stochastic differential equations. Okay, so they write it in this form, where I write the only increments. I don't write it as a rate of increment, but just as an increment over a really tiny increment step of dt. So this is the component that sort of is driving back to the origin x equal to 0, and this part basically tells in that tiny interval what was the kick, what was the amount of kick, and basically then they define it as the mean 0. So the kick, the delta x is basically on an average, you can go up, you can come down, that's unbiased. So therefore the average kick length is 0, but it has a variance. It has a variance given by, so now in the standard notation, do you write sigma square here or sigma? Okay, I'll fix this. Sigma square, yeah, that makes sense. So the variance is now given by the length of the time interval. So this is something very interesting. So basically what it's saying is that, so this term, the deterministic sort of component, is proportional to the time interval in a mean sense, whereas this, okay, has a variance which is proportional to the time interval. Okay, this is how mathematicians would like to define, and in fact basically WT is called the Wiener process, and delta WT is called the increments of the Wiener process. So in the simplest way, WT is basically what you just learned in the previous class, which is a random walker, a Brownian motion's position over time. dW basically represents the increments in the the positions of the Brownian motion. Okay. There's no time dependence here. There is absolutely no time dependence. It's an increment, depends on the increment. So the longer I wait, larger will be the variance. And basically this relates to a fact called, if you don't know this, it's okay. How many of you know that the Brownian motion has a very interesting mean square displacement? What is it? So mean square displacement, square of the displacement is proportional to the time. Okay. So square of the displacement is sort of like variance from the initial point, right? So that scales with time. That's precisely what this is doing. So the increment is proportional to the variance of the increment is proportional to the time interval. So basically they're mathematically equivalent statements. Okay. So just to be sure, it doesn't depend on time, it depends on the time interval. Okay. Okay. So this is where we have very basically defined how do we understand the stochastic fluctuations around an equilibrium. Now before we move forward, I want to just stop a bit and think back about what exactly is alpha. What is sir?
I still didn't understand how did that help us with the defining like
this one.
Yeah.
So now it's not a the ordinary differential equation formalism requires you to have a smooth function on the right hand side. So but this is a totally new calculus that we are defining. Totally new calculus that describes the changes in time, even in continuous time. Okay, and I can define the properties of dW very cleanly, right? So so now, to be very honest, I am beyond this. It's also a bit difficult for me to exactly explain why this entirely solves the problem. The main point is that I have now gotten away from a rate to a difference equation, but still in continuous time. Okay.
Like eta t could be like really large or really small, so it was like totally random. But here, if I choose like small time interval, then dWt will be like really small.
Yeah, when you take dWt really small, the variance of this really goes down to 0. I think that's probably the basic idea. Correct. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now let us now pay a little bit of attention to alpha. What exactly is alpha? So alpha tells me, let's just to understand this, let us go back to the deterministic version and plot. Let's say I start with some initial perturbation x0. If I were to plot for some alpha, this is how it would look like, right? For some arbitrary alpha. Now, if I increase alpha, how would this curve look like? A faster decay, right? If I reduce alpha, okay, this would be. So what does therefore alpha indicate? What does alpha indicate? It's a measure of do all of you agree with this? So the interpretation of alpha is a return rate to the equilibrium. Okay, all good so far? Yeah.
Maybe it's a live question. But so when t goes like close to 0, the dWt is sort of basically goes to 0. So the second term goes to 0 and becomes deterministic. I'm guessing, right?
No, it doesn't become deterministic.
Okay.
No. You mean when the delta t goes to 0, right?
Yes, when dt goes to 0.
But you always, as long as you don't put it as 0, it's always, then you are not even making an increment if it's actually equal to 0. Okay. Okay, so now So alpha is the return rate to the equilibrium. So if I now ask you, how do you think alpha affects the overall dynamics with stochasticity? What would be your intuition? Okay, imagine I now take two systems. One has a large alpha, other has a small alpha. But now we had imagine there was a stochasticity inbuilt into the system. So basically the entire equation. So this was okay in the absence of stochasticity. But how do you think the results would look like if we had stochasticity? For two values of alpha, one small alpha, one large alpha, how do you think the results would look like? Okay, so decay rate, what does it, let's say if this is how the small alpha system would look like, right? How do you think a large alpha system would look like? Now, do you realize why this has changed to this now? Because now the perturbations are sort of spontaneously always introduced by this term, right? So it sort of goes away, but the first term will try to pull it back, so it comes back, but there's always a tension between the two, right? So it's kicking and this is pulling back, this is kicking in random directions, remember? So it's pulling back, so you can sort of imagine the system is always trying to come back to zero, but there is a stochasticity which is pushing you back and forth. Okay, now let's say this was some baseline value of alpha. If I reduce alpha, what do you think will happen?
The fluctuation.
So you're saying the noise will increase, but remember, where is the noise? The noise is actually here, no?
I'm not taking zero.
So you're not changing sigma, right? You're fixing sigma.
Yes.
Okay.
But still, even if I'm not returning to zero, at that point there will be another noise. So it's like the chances of me getting away from zero will increase.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. Do all of you agree with him? So what he is trying to say is that, so imagine there was a kick. Okay, now it has moved away from the equilibrium and the system is now trying to come back because of the deterministic term. But because alpha is slow, it takes longer to come back. Some other kick might actually push you, right? So what some of you are predicting, in fact, is that the variance would appear now big. Do all of you agree with this?
Yes.
Isn't it actually very interesting? Although I did not change the variance of the drive of the external stochastic term. So I did not change the variance of the external stochasticity, but just the internal dynamics is changing the stochasticity of the time series. Is it something that all of you agree on? Okay, excellent. So let's now keep this. So basically what you're trying to say is that can you all see here if I write? Okay, I think Boaz is there. So if what you're saying is correct intuitively, if I were to plot alpha on the x-axis, so I were to plot the variance of x on the y-axis, how would this look like? So for large alpha, variance is low. For small alpha, variance might be high. This is the prediction, sort of intuitive prediction. Is that right? So it turns out that if you can actually derive the expression for variance, and in fact this would be exactly true. So in fact the mathematical expression for variance of x, I don't know if there is a 2 or not. That really depends on how we define stochasticity. Yes.
On your graph above, the red is smaller alpha than the red.
Oh, right. Sorry. I messed up. So the red one is small alpha. And larger. Okay, thank you. All good so far? Okay. So now why are we doing all of this? Because we want to get back to this. So because we want to address some of these questions. Okay, so I'll make some connections to addressing these questions. Okay, now having done this, what happened? So suddenly my What I'm seeing is very different, which is my WhatsApp. Okay. I'm glad you did not see it. So. Okay. So now let's do this. Okay. So now, so I'm going to introduce a classic model in the literature in ecology, in theoretical ecology, from 1970s that has tried to understand these ideas of abrupt changes in many ecosystems. So these were back then were called by the name thresholds, which are still being used. There is some threshold in the ecosystem, and if you cross the threshold, things will be dramatically different. Okay. So there were a few papers in the context of how some sorts of worms can potentially, and bugs can potentially change some forestry ecosystems entirely. There were so there was a review article that Robert May, the famous Robert May, wrote arguing that these ideas of thresholds could be present in a number of ecological contexts. Like, for example, if you think of a population, now if you interpret instead of, you often think of this equation as logistic model as a population dynamical equation, right? So, but he argued, you can think of it also more broadly as a biomass density of an ecosystem, and usually there are always many other species that are harvesting and extracting these biomasses. The simplest example could be that if the biomass is that of grasses, maybe there are herbivores, grazers who actually consume, and often these these herbivores and grazing, they happen in a non-linear way. So what do I mean by that non-linear way? That functional form, how many of you have seen such a functional form before? I mean, except those from my class, my school, my lab. Other guys, some of you have seen, right? So what this basically tries to tell you, so I'm going to erase this part now. So what this tells you is that there is a logistically growing population of some important ecological system, consumers, and they are being grazed by some other, component of the ecosystem. What this basically tells you, if you plot the grazing rate or the harvesting rate, it actually is a nonlinear function, basically of a sigmoidal form. So when the biomass density or the ecosystem productivity is very low, you have a very low amount of harvesting or grazing, because grazers are not attracted to this area at all. There's hardly any return, right? But the moment the amount of biomass exceeds a threshold, which is roughly V0, the harvesting increases. But the harvesting saturates eventually, because harvesters or the grazers can only eat so much. Just because there is large amount of food, they won't consume all of it. So there will be non-linearity. So initial slow increase followed by a rapid increase and then a saturation. A standard sigmoidal curve. Now, what's happening in the rate of change of biomass density in this equation tells that there's a logistic growth. Okay, so logistic growth would look like something like this, right? Yes. Yeah.
So in that case, in the rate of increase of biomass is greater than the rate of increase, because otherwise that we never reach a point at which.
Yeah. Yes, sure. You're right. You're absolutely right. So, how are these two related? Biomass grazing rate depends on what? Sorry.
So the rate of increase of biomass has to be greater than the grazing rate. Otherwise, we will.
Otherwise, the entire thing will go extinct. Exactly. You're absolutely right. Yeah. So, for example, if this is the logistic population growth rate curve, this is the harvesting growth rate curve. So, where will they reach an equilibrium? Wherever the growth rate matches the harvesting rate. So, there are two equilibrium. one equilibrium here, another equilibrium here. So this is the equilibrium where, so instead of reaching the carrying capacity now, you would be now at a much lower value than the carrying capacity because of the grazers. Okay, so this is where the equilibrium will be, and in fact, it's not too hard to find that this will be the stable equilibrium. This will be the unstable equilibrium. Now, under some conditions of parameter values, you can actually have interesting scenarios such as this. Oh, sorry. So depending on some combination of parameter values, you can actually have these kind of a, this is a really badly drawn curve, sorry, but if you go to any of the original papers, you should be able to find the right parameter values. So now this is a reasonable thing, right? Because this is a sigmoidally increasing thing, and you can achieve something like this. So how many equilibrium points are there? You basically, if you apply the principle that equilibrium now corresponds to wherever the logistic growth matches the grazing losses. How many are there? There is wherever, that means whenever these two lines are intersecting, right? So one of them would be here, another one would be here, here, and here, right? There are actually 4 equilibrium points just because of the non-linearity of the grazing. Okay, and now can you find out the stability of each of these equilibrium? So you have done quite a bit of stability analysis last week without recoursing to any complicated algebras. Can you do that? So the way I would do it is, okay, let's look at this equilibrium. Okay, so if I make a perturbation to a higher value, what happens? The grazing exceeds the growth. So therefore, this has to come back. On the other hand, if I make a perturbation to the left, the growth exceeds the grazing. So therefore, it comes back to, therefore, this has to be a stable equilibrium. And the amazing trick with nonlinear dynamics with ordinary differential equations is that once you know the stability of one equilibrium, I can just alternate. This has to be unstable. This has to be stable. This has to be unstable again. Do all of you know this trick by now? Okay, so you can't have two unstable equilibrium next to each other under some very special bifurcation like points. Yes.
Is this assuming a fixed number of grazers?
We are assuming a fixed number of grazers, absolutely. Otherwise, you would not have saturation. That's a very good point. Yes. Okay. So now, what I will show you next is what we call a bifurcation diagram. Have you seen such a diagram? These are called bifurcation diagrams. So what I'm now plotting here is this coefficient C on the x-axis and Y is the equilibrium biomass density. What this shows you is that if the grazing density is very low, you will have biomass density which is close to carrying capacity. Okay. However, when you increase the biomass grazing rate, there are some intermediate values. You can actually have these multiple equilibrium, and that corresponds to an example graph I have drawn. Okay. On the other hand, if you had a very high grazing rate, you would have only one equilibrium which corresponds to a low biomass density. Okay, so these things make sense, right? Very low grazing, we have a high carry, high biomass density close enough to carrying capacity. Very high grazing rate, very low population, very low biomass density. But interestingly, in the intermediate region, it's not a linear response. What you have is there is this threshold point or a bifurcation point where you have a nonlinear response of the system to small changes. So here's the main interesting point, right? If I'm somewhere here at 2.6, if I make even an infinitesimally small increment in the grazing rate, the biomass density drops off from this to this. There is no sort of smooth flow. It's an abrupt change. This state just ceases to exist anymore. Okay. So this region is called the region of bistability. So these two are called the bifurcation points, sometimes also critical points, although critical points is from a physics language would be only the points of phase transitions, but in applied mathematics as well as in ecology, these are also called critical points. Yes.
So we should look like in that graph on the left, when the growth was slow initially, so the R was low and then it went to carrying capacity was 1 equilibrium, but as the growth rate was higher, it sort of became 2. So essentially, if you plotted like number of equilibria versus growth rate, like R, you see that sort of bifurcation emerge.
Yeah, so you can actually plot the bifurcation diagram as a function of the growth rate R, as a function of the grazing rate C, also as a function of the carrying capacity K. So there are 3-4 parameters, right, actually in this model. So it's entirely your choice. So you will find similar sort of bifurcations. They're called fold bifurcations or hardinal bifurcations across a wide range of these possibilities. Not all, but wide range of these possibilities. So I'm showing you one such case here.
So natural systems, how would you decide which parameters you want?
Absolutely, there is no easy answer. But for example, here, so grazing rate is something a manager can control, which is precisely why there is an interest in this. So some of it is decided by the intrinsic dynamics. Some of it is decided by what we can do, what we can control. For example, whereas R would be very hard to control directly by any of us, right? It's dependent more on the intrinsic demographic parameters and the environmental parameters, both of which are not in our control. Whereas grazing rate could be something that we can potentially control, managers can potentially control. Okay, so basically the key take-home message from this is, we can capture these abrupt changes of the type we saw in the various data sets using a very simple model. Okay, but we are not happy with that entirely, because why? There is no stochasticity here. So without stochasticity, things are often very boring. Okay, so before I go forward, I want to ask you, how many of you know what's the potential? Did you say something that was covered last week? The idea of potentials? Okay, so so now the idea of potential, the nice thing about these simple class of models rather than the generalized load covered terrain models is that in this simple one variable, what we call lumped into single variable equations, is that we can always define a potential function like this. We can always define a Lyapunov function. Okay, and in fact the definition of that is, if you have an equation of this form, you can define a potential function as an integral of, okay, so it's as simple as this. Okay, so if you now take the equation I showed you in the previous slide, and if you do this integration, you will actually find that in the bistable region, this is how the potential would look like. So what are the features of this potential? It has 2 minima. So what happens whenever there are 2 minima? If you roll a ball in a in a potential but with 2 minima, what happens? Depending on where you start, it sort of goes into one of them. Okay, that's precisely the idea of bistability or multiple stable states. Depending on the initial conditions, you go to one of the attractors, right? So that's precisely, if I start the ball here, it comes and stops here. If I start the ball here, it comes and stops here. So you should think of it as a highly damped system, which means a lot of friction. So it comes and stops at the center, it doesn't overshoot. Okay, so, and on the other hand, if I start anywhere beyond this point here, it just falls into this well. Okay, so these potential diagrams are very useful to think about the number of equilibrium and to get an intuitive picture of what are the equilibrium values. And the interesting point is that the minima correspond to the stable equilibrium, because any perturbation, what happens to a perturbation? It comes back, right? So minima corresponds to a stable equilibrium and the maxima corresponds to unstable equilibrium, right? Excellent. Now we have to put together all these ideas we have learned. Okay, and the region to which you can make some perturbation, it still comes back, right? So that region is called the basin of attraction. And there was a very classic paper by Holling in one of the ecology journals in 1973 saying that this basin of attraction is a good measure of ecological resilience. But however, the challenge is, how on the earth will I know what is this basin of attraction? To really know that, to really empirically measure something like the basin of attraction, I will have to do a lot of perturbation experiments to an ecosystem and wait for one of them to go out and then say, this is the maximum I can perturb. And so it means this is the edge of my base. It is the edge of the stability of ecosystem, and that's very risky. If you're dealing with natural ecosystems, we don't want to cause some dramatic changes while doing experiments. Okay, so the idea of basin of attraction and that of ecological resilience was very attractive, but people realized over time that it's not necessarily very useful. So how do we make that useful? Okay, to again, so I think I covered the part on I have an animation of hysteresis which I think which I can sort of skip, which is not too interesting. I think I already covered all these points, minima, maxima, and it also captures the ideas of hysteresis very nicely. So I'm going to skip through this. What we now do is the missing element that we have had so far is that of stochasticity. Okay, so what I have now done is to this differential equation, which was an ordinary differential equation, I've added some amount of stochasticity, just like the way I was adding to only the perturbations of the equilibrium. Now I have done to the entire equation. Okay, and then if you now ask, now this stochasticity that we added here was to a system which had, if you look at only this equation, it was basically having only one equilibrium, right? In some sense, of course, in some sense, it's a bit of cheating because I started here, went near an equilibrium, and then added some stochasticity. So what I have now done is I am considering the entire dynamics and adding some stochasticity. What all do you think can happen when you add stochasticity to a system which has two stable states? It can be forced from one to the other. So in fact, if you do simulations, that's precisely what you find. So you can find two types of general scenarios. The one type is called an extinction, a point that Jacopo covered in the morning. So for example, if for whatever reason, if the fluctuations take you to a state of zero biomass, right? It's an extinction state. Then you can, it's a point of no return, right? So you're just stuck there. So because there is no regeneration that's possible. So that's one possible scenario, that of extinction. The other one would be that of you sort of keep going back and forth between the stable equilibrium. So that's like, similar to saying this ball is sort of, going back and forth between the two minima of two minima. Okay. So now, this is not quite a limit cycle, right? Because limit cycle would mean that there is a equilibrium which is unstable and therefore it spirals out, but there is something that sort of pushes back. So it's not a limit cycle. It's actually there are two stable equilibrium, and you sort of stochasticity is pushing you back and forth. Okay. So the question to ask in this context is, imagine sort of, a thought experiment where there is an ecosystem in this state. Okay. So there are, I have a bunch of grazers with me. Yeah.
How is stochasticity different from the perturbations we were talking about?
In this case, they're actually identical. Yeah, absolutely, yes, identical. So the only difference was that I was adding stochasticity to the linearized equation in this case, whereas I'm now doing it for the full nonlinear equation. Only because of that you're able to find that back and forth oscillations.
Yeah, another question, I was trying to relate this bifurcation diagram to the desertification process that you talked earlier. There were two explanations of two fixed points already existing or the fixed point changing. And now I'm thinking that depending on where the system is, like whether it's on the dotted line state or on the solid lines, can we say that the potential plane is also, so I would assume that when it's on the dotted line state, then there are two bistable.
No, see, the system cannot be on the dotted line at all because it's like a ball will not stay at the top of a hill, right? Even if it's there, it's for a very short amount of time. So when you observe something, it's probably in one of these two or near those two. Okay, so what you're asking is a really good question. I have a slide that tries to answer that question eventually. Yes.
Maybe just to add to that. I think sometimes the thing that's not clear when you look at a diagram like this is that for every value of C, there exists a potential.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And so as you sort of change the value of C, you'll change whether, you'll change what your potential looks like. And so you can change how many wells it has, for instance. So way to the left of this curve, where you just have the green, imagine taking a vertical slice. There you have a potential with only one well, right? And way to the right, you have again a potential with only one well. And only in this middle region, you have this potential with two wells. Maybe it was obvious, but I often find this somewhat strange to think about because the potential is in your head and there are many of them. So I thought maybe
that's a really that's a really good clarification. Thank you, Akshit, for clarifying this. Is that point clear to everyone? It's a really wonderful clarification. Okay, if you think of potential, the picture I showed you in the previous slide, what I showed you was something in this region. But if you go to this region, there is only one stable state, therefore the potential will have only one well. If you go to this side, again the same. So the well in the minima in this case will be only at the low values of V. The minima here will be at the high values. Only in the intermediate region you have both the minima. And as you change the parameter value, the potential landscape is actually changing with time. Okay, and in fact, that's precisely what we are coming to now. Imagine an ecosystem, okay, which is extremely undisturbed as of now, and therefore close to low or zero grazing rates. So therefore, the biomass is at the carrying capacity. Now I introduce a few grazers. They are doing fantastic. So I will therefore decide to increase the grazing rate. And there is a small reduction in the overall biomass density. And why should I should be fine with it, right? So what I will do is, over time, imagine I am slowly increasing the grazing rate in the system. So what do you expect to happen? The biomass density is following this line, right? It's think of it as now things are changing with time, but very slowly. So at every point in time, now at this point there was only one potential minima. So the ball is in this high value of V, high value of biomass density. It continues to stay there. It continues to stay there. It continues to stay there. Okay, and I'm able to maintain ecosystem in a good way, and there is a linear response. So I'm not really bothered. And I'm here, and suddenly what happens? One of the wells just disappears the moment I'm hitting this point. And therefore, the only minima that's available is actually low grazing minima. So the question to ask is, could I have somehow stopped my greediness somewhere here and stopped the grazing rates so that the ecosystem is fine, my grazers are fine. Because if I collapse to this state, the ecosystem is not yielding good productivity, my grazers will all also go down in numbers, right? So my goal should be to be stable, somehow figure out that I'm getting close to this point. But of course, in a mathematical model, I can solve all the equation. I know the exact parameter value, but in the real world, I don't know, right? Yes.
Yeah. So, and if you want to backtrack after you reach that point and you want to go back, by reducing the grazing rate, you're not going to jump back up immediately.
Exactly. Now imagine if there was indeed a push down here, it would get stuck here because it's now in the lower potential, right? Unless I sort of reduce this to dramatically low values, then only it's able to come back. Okay, so that's really what makes these bistable systems very challenging. Okay, so now I want to emphasize two different ways. I want to go a bit fast now. Okay, sorry. we can discuss more. So there are two ways that transitions can happen. This is what I want to emphasize between these two slides. These are called critical transitions, where the grazing rate is changing slowly and the transition happens close to this bifurcation point. That's one way. And this is an example time series. You can also have another way where I'm actually the mean value is somewhere in the middle, but the stochasticity alone is taking you back and forth. So because the environment is so noisy, it crosses this boundary, it falls here, again it goes back, keeps going back and forth because of the fact that environmental stochasticity is very high, but the mean value is actually not changing. There are two different ways these transitions could happen. In fact, that was actually what some of you identified, right? Oh, after a while, suddenly the stable state shifted, right? The other one was stochasticity is driving them from one to the other, right? So there are two different ways. So these are called stochastic transitions because the primary driver here is stochasticity, whereas here these are called critical transitions because I am getting close to this critical or the bifurcation point. And of course, stochasticity is still there, but primary reason is I'm just now too close to the bifurcation point. So there are two ways these transitions could happen. Okay. Now, the question to ask, okay, this is basically indicating that there was a transition right from here to here without getting close to this because of the an external stochasticity. Okay. So the question to ask is that, as I'm approaching this point, is there some way I could have anticipated sort of, proximity to this bifurcation point? Okay. How do we know? Now, to do that, I'm now doing what Akshit told, which is I am plotting these potential functions only for this branch for different points. Do you all understand what I'm doing now? So, for example, when I'm at this point, this is how the potential function would look like. So remember, I am now not plotting the full potential function. I'm plotting only the local potential function that corresponds to this equilibrium. Okay, so I'm not plotting the full. Technically, for this case, if there is actually another minima here, I'm not plotting because my ecosystem state is actually here. Now tell me this, there is a potential well here, there's a potential well here, there's a potential well here. As you are going close to the critical point, what are all the features that you're observing that are changing as you go from here to here to here? Basin of attraction is reducing. Yes. Okay. What else? Okay. So how did you connect the rate to this? So rate is the alpha here. How did you connect the rate to this? So do you all see the point? In fact, it's possible to show that the steepness of this quadratic potential actually directly relates to alpha. Okay. So this has a larger value of alpha. So it has a faster rate of return. This has a smaller value of alpha and even smaller value of alpha. So you remember what we did here? So what do you expect now? So as you go from here to here to here, what do you expect in the stochastic time series then? The fluctuations must increase, right? So therefore, the idea is that the increase in the fluctuations, and in fact, there is one more feature that you can see here. So this actually comes from the non-linear effects, not the linear effects. So if you considered only linear effects, all the potential would be symmetric. But if you look at the non-linear effects, which means that here I have to include one more term, you also find that the potential becomes sort of asymmetric and skewed. Okay, so basically all of these potentials will have an impact on how the system is oscillating around the equilibrium. Okay, so if you now plot time series, if you simulate this equation and if you plot the time series, do you see the differences? What do you see? So variations are large, and secondly, what else do you see? Yeah, there is more sort of one way skewed sort of fluctuations, right? So in fact, if you plot this, so actually basically if you now take the time series, and there are ways to analyze time series, you can actually measure the return rates from the time series data. What you actually find is that you can measure that by autocorrelation function, if you are familiar with. Okay, so you measure the autocorrelation function, and then you can actually extract this coefficient alpha. You find that As you go closer, you will have a slower response to perturbation. You will also have an increased variability, as all of you said. You can also have an increased skewed fluctuations. Okay, so all of this. So the basic idea is that, even though I don't know where I am on this plot, if I observe all these trends, can I now infer the opposite, which is that, oh, maybe I'm getting too close to these bifurcation points.
The potential landscape.
This equation. Okay. So in fact, if you this is an example of a simulated time series. Okay, so you are in a computer simulation of these differential equations. You sort of induce this collapse by slowly increasing the grazing rate. You can see that the mean value is reducing, and there is a sudden collapse by 1000 time step. If you measure the autocorrelation, which is a direct measure of the alpha, it's increasing. If you measure the standard deviation, which is the strength of fluctuations, that's increasing. If you measure how skewed it is, it's reducing in this case. Okay, so increasing in the magnitude but reducing in the in the numerical values. Okay, so basically, conversely, we can argue that changes in these quantities could indicate that we are approaching a tipping point or a bifurcation point. Now remember that why am I emphasizing stochasticity here? Imagine if we had a deterministic system, I would not experience any fluctuations, so therefore there is no question of variance. If I had taken the same equations, deterministic equations, right? Okay, so there would have, because everything that I am measuring here, autocorrelation function, standard deviation, skewness, they are all metrics of the stochastic fluctuations and how stochastic fluctuations are happening over time. What is their magnitude? How are they related to one another over time? So therefore, introducing stochasticity actually can inform us things. Although we think that stochasticity often sort of kills various things and does bad things, what you see here is that stochasticity helps us measure the underlying landscape. In this specific case, it actually helps us measure the underlying potential landscape, some features of the potential landscape. If we did not have stochasticity, I wouldn't have been able to do that at all. Okay, so now so what I will do is I will so there are the second part. Okay, these are all the various. I will share these slides with Akshit, and he will share with all of you. I have a second part of this first part, okay, where there is also people have done experiments and have shown that some of these do happen. I will go over them very, very fast. So what they did was they studied Daphnia in an experimental setup in the lab. They sort of collapsed these populations as a function of time by underfeeding them over time, and this experiment was done over a sort of duration of 1 year. And when they measured coefficient of variation and skewness, they actually find that roughly about a month or so ahead of time, they were able to detect signatures of these early warning signals even before the actual collapse of the populations happened. There is another paper, it is an amazing paper because here this is an empirically constructed bifurcation diagram which looks so much like what we do in the model, right? So even in that we find they find similar results. Okay, these experiments were done with yeast. The previous experiments were done with Daphnia. Okay, so I would encourage you to sort of read these papers because you see these beautiful bifurcation diagrams in very simple mathematical models. Now there are also experiments that one can do with microbes, smaller organisms, and in fact there is actually a paper where they induced a large-scale regime shift in a lake, not only in smaller beakers, and they found similar results. Okay, so I'm going to skip this part of it entirely, and let me show a few. Let me sort of try to show you a couple of examples on how stochasticity can still challenge our intuitions in interesting ways. Okay, so let me see. I have to go. I'm going to skip all of this. So now that you have learned all these things so far, if I showed you this, what's your inference? Huh? Okay. Sorry. Alpha is okay. So some value of alpha. What is the most likely phenomena or equation I am simulating here? This is from a computer simulation. This is not real data. Random walk would just drift off. No, random walk will not keep coming back to zero. It's actually this. So what I am showing you here is actually this. Okay. So this is like a quiz of what all you have learned. Okay. If you look at this, what do you now infer? There are two stable states. Where are the two stable states? -1 and +1, and then some stochasticities switching back and forth. Is that right? Okay. So now let me show you something interesting. Okay. I need the eraser first. So here, in this equation, right, which is basically the same equation. Okay, so I'm adding some stochasticity at every instant in time, and the stochastic perturbations are driving the system, right? Now, and that is leading to this. So usually, what is your now intuition? So if there is a stable equilibrium and some stochasticity, what would you conclude? You would conclude that the stochasticity would make the system fluctuate around the equilibrium. Okay, so one simple way to think about this is that if you find a potential function for this, I will leave it as an exercise to you. It actually will be this. So if you find a potential function for this, it would be alpha x squared by 2. How did I obtain this? You take the deterministic part, multiply by minus sign, and then do the integration. So you get alpha x squared by 2. So it's same as saying, so there is a ball here which is kicked around. You know, it's trying to come back to equilibrium, which is the minima, but it's constantly getting kicked around. Okay. So now, now this is an equation where and the second one is a different equation where you have two stable states and the stochasticity is driving back and forth. Is that right? That would be your inference, right? Okay. Now let's consider, don't ask me why I am writing this, okay? But let's just consider this. Do you now know what I have done here? So what have I done here? So there is the same force is trying to pull back the system to 0, but what's happening to this part now? What have I done here? So there is a stochastic term, the Gaussian, noise here, but Gaussian noise is now multiplied not by a constant value sigma, but it's multiplied by, for a better comparison, I will do this. It's multiplied by something that depends on the state variable itself. Okay, so this type of noise, where the noise does not depend on the state variable, they are called additive noise. So noise sort of gets added to the rate function, the growth rate or the growth rate function, and these are called multiplicative noise, because the noise term is multiplied by a function which is of the state variable. Okay. Now here is a catch. Okay. So the moment you write a differential equation in this way, it turns out that all of our intuition about the basic calculus just is just thrown off. Okay. So people have come, now it turns out that there are many different calculus to describe this stochastic differential equation. So we are going to choose something called Ito calculus. Unfortunately, I am going to do this without really telling you what is Ito calculus. So you have to, for the time being, accept that there's something called Ito calculus, which I'm going to use. Okay, so don't worry what it is. I will not tell you right now, because today, because we're getting close to lunchtime, I will just want to make some interesting point. So how do you think this is different from this, from a purely intuitive point of view? Averaging? Why does it not? See, let us take an average of the entire equation. If I take an average of this side, this entire side, the rate of change, right? Average rate of change will be average rate of change of this, which will be same as this. And this, if I take an average of this, what would that be? This is anyway an uncorrelated noise. So this, I can separate these two. It's a reasonable approximation. Then this would just be 0, no? So this contribution would be 0 on an average, just as in this case. The average should not change. Yes?
So when you take x equal to 0 in the second equation, the stochastic part of the sigma times
eta t
becomes a positive value. It's a non-zero value.
Okay.
Whereas if you take 1, x is 1 or minus 1, then the deterministic part is negative, so it's negative alpha. The stochastic part is 0. So it's almost like if you get to those minus 1 or plus 1, you're not going to like go away from there. Whereas if you're at 0, although like the deterministic part is 0, the stochastic part is push you away from.
It's a really, really good point. Now, just to make our life a bit easy and put some intuition, think of x as the location of an animal. Okay. Animals have preference for a home. It's called home range. You know, they have a home, they move around their home, and it's called a home range. So if an animal is, this is their preferred location. This is their home, right? Roosting site or something like that. Okay, their cave or whatever. Okay, and of course they're also influenced by stochastic decision process. So because of that, you can see that you can sort of think that they are moving back and forth between their homes. That's how they move. Now, this is an interesting case where, if you again use the same analogy, what this means is that, okay, this is their preference for being at home, this is their home. But however, they're influenced by this crazy stochastic term which has this form, which is the amount of randomness in their decision process is highest at home. So when they are at home, they will very strongly randomly decide to go either left or right. On the other hand, when they reach the edges of -1 and +1, what do? They entirely stop being random. What will they do when they reach plus or -1? They stop being random and they will let their innate preference take over. Does that make sense? Meaning, if I am near my home, I can be a bit flexible and be bold, right? Sometimes I'll go here, sometimes I'll go there. But imagine I am now here at the edge. Should I be equally random now or not? I better be not random. I should actually move here, right? So that's what this is capturing. Is that fine? Does that make sense? Again, if I am on this edge, should I be random? If I am random, I'll probably tip off here, right? So that's what this does. So what this tells you is that the stochasticity depends on where I am. So that's what this does. Now, I will show you some simulations. So what do you think will happen? So let us say, I want you to guess this. Imagine the stochasticity is very low. Imagine stochasticity is very, how do you think the animal will move? Let's say I'm starting at home. Then some random perturbation will, let's do this. Let's say now a random perturbation will kick me away from home. And then what will happen? I'll come back. And then, is this what you expect? Now imagine that the stochasticity is very, very high. What do you think will happen? I will get a larger kicks. And then, I'll come back, I get another kick. And then, I'll stay here.
The value is equal to 1 or minus.
But if I'm here, the stochasticity is 0, but this is going to now pull me back, no? And remember, one interesting thing about this term is it's deterministic. It will try to bring me at the center, whereas stochasticity has no such preference. So what do you think? How do you think this will look like for low and large sigma? So the red line is large sigma. So it would just have larger variance like the previous example you mentioned. Is that what you all expect? That's what I would expect at least. But now I will show you some simulations. Okay. So what I have done is I asked ChatGPT, hey, please write a code to simulate this equation. Okay. And it actually did. So I now have, so this is, so you can see, actually I asked this, generated by ChatGPT with the prompt, please write an R code for simulating and plotting OU process. It's actually amazing. It actually gave me with comments and everything. Okay, see, so this is the time series. This is the distribution. Okay, and then what I did was I also asked, hey, look, please modify the code to simulate the SDE given by, which has these two fixed points, 1 at +1, 1 at -1, and then I added a additive stochasticity. It actually again gave me something. Let me see if it's correct. See, it's cool, no? So, but only here is the challenge though. 1 year back, it would make a lot of mistakes in the codes. It actually is not making any more those kind of mistakes. Okay. Now in the third code, I made the edits here. Okay, I just I took the code that it generated for the OU process, and then I multiplied the noise term with this 1 minus x squared term. Okay, now there is a parameter called sigma here. Let us now do 0.2, which is a small value of sigma. Let us simulate. So this is on the expected lines. So small sigma, right? So I could choose even smaller. This is how it would look like. So you can sort of think it's sort of fluctuating around 0, right? And the histogram is a time series. Because I'm starting at 1, it sort of dies off here and then fluctuates around 0. Yeah?
So let's say if you're low sigma, it's histograms are low, but there will be one sweet spot when the sigma will be so large that the histogram will so too.
Okay, now we will see what happens with large sigma. See, so this is what happens with large sigma. If you look at the time series, this is how it looks like. So just to be sure that I am not simulating the other model, you can just look at the equation. Okay, see what I have done is the linear term is just this. It's basically the deterministic term is basically same as this. So you should think of mu as 0 here, and then the noise term is 1 minus x square. Okay, this is what I have done. So now here is the interesting thing. When I showed you, so do you see what's happening now? What's happening here? It's going to 1, getting stuck there because the noise is 0, but somehow it should have come back. No, it's not coming back. But the moment it comes back, it actually sometimes goes all the way to the other state. Okay, it's actually rarely staying near its home anymore. It's either at that extreme or this extreme, because it's extremely indecisive at the home. It's extremely indecisive and random when at home, but it actually becomes highly deterministic at edges. And in fact, deterministic not to stay here, deterministic to actually go there. But despite that, they actually end up staying at the corners more than they actually should be at the center. Okay. So now here is the, so is this, I mean, when I saw this, I found this extremely surprising, but some of you are geniuses. You told, yeah, they would be at the edges, obviously. Yeah, correct. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, if you think about it clearly, if you understand how this actually is happening, even now I get confused. Why is this happening? It's actually a very subtle interplay of time scales and the strength of noise that actually leads to this. Now, this leads me to the following question in the end. Okay. I'll go back to slides now. So when I showed you this, you all said this is an OU process with a noise. When I showed you this, you all said it's a bistable system with noise pushing back and forth. But now there is a third possibility. This could also come from the OU process, but with this type of a noise. Isn't that right? In fact, I'll show you this here. So this is an example of a unimodal PDF. This is like a standard OU process, and the white arrow represents where the stable state is. But this is actually also a OU-like process with a steady state distribution, which is a unimodal at 0. But you look at the equations. The equation actually has two stable states, 1 at +1, 1 at -1. But because the noise is somewhat messed up, the results are actually Same, the result appears same for very different underlying processes. Here's another example. So in this example, there are actually two stable states, and it's going back and forth. In this example, there's only one stable state, but it's still going back and forth. So this now raises a really tough question to us. If somebody were to give you these two data only, but without the equations, would you be able to tell what the underlying equations were?
Asymmetry about the endpoints is more symmetric about.
But see, that's a quantitative difference. I could have found better parameters that would make them look even more similar, but that's not a qualitative difference, right? You understand the difference between qualitative and quantitative?
Endpoints would obviously be asymmetric because you can't cross the.
But this is a different kind of tipping point. This is actually not even a tipping point. These are what I would call stochastic transitions, right? Because I'm not going near a bifurcation at all here. It's entirely driven by stochasticity. Large stochasticity is driving them back and forth. Remember, in one of the slides, I distinguished stochastic transitions from a tipping point and critical transitions. This is an example of stochastic transition. Okay.
In the first case, like if there is a stable point, we can see like it stays sometime fluctuating there.
Oh, you can see, is it? Okay, I can't see. You're very smart, huh? Okay, maybe the resident time is a bit different, but you look at this. But if you look at the steady state in the end, steady state distributions are qualitatively similar, right? Okay, so now in the tutorial today, so Arshad will actually try to discuss this question. Imagine you did not know the equations, but if you knew only the time series, which have nearly identical PDFs like this or in the previous case, can you distinguish them by some sort of magical analysis? Okay, so that's what Arshad will present in the evening today. So basically, sort of to conclude my first talk today, so the first take-home message would be that there are many ecological and complex systems which show multiple stable states. There is now a lot of empirical evidence. People can also do experiments in the context of microbial systems, even in lakes, as large as lakes, and they can switch between these states. There is now empirical evidence that systems can switch between these alternative states, and to detect when they are switching, stochasticity surprisingly actually informs us rather than kills the information. Stochasticity actually helps us infer things better than a purely deterministic system would have. And finally, stochasticity can induce some really bizarre effects that you don't expect. You expect that I would not personally expect that stochasticity will make a unistable state look like a bistable state. I would have never thought as an undergrad, at least. Until somebody had told me, I would have never thought about that. But it turns out it is actually possible. Okay. And what is also very interesting is that there are actually methods that can help us differentiate these two systems, although they seem to have really similar properties. Okay, so that is something that Arshad will cover in the evening today. Thank you very much, and let's go for lunch.